welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans, for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Monday, June 17th, 2024, and a belated Happy Father's Day to all of you who celebrated over the weekend. So I'm here with you today to talk about 2024 college football unit rankings according to the three most respected season preview magazines out there, Athlon, Lindy's, and Phil Steele's. I just got Phil Steele's a couple of days ago. I've been nerding out with these magazines for the last few days, and it has been glorious. So I'm going to tell you where Ohio State's offensive and defensive position groups landed in these preseason rankings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the players who headline each position group, and then maybe identify a player or two from each room that most fans might not be thinking about right now. So let's get started. Let's start with the quarterback room. Now, Athlon ranks the Ohio State quarterbacks third nationally. Phil Steele has the Buckeyes ranked 19th nationally at quarterback. Now, Lindy's didn't do a unit ranking for quarterbacks. They have a backfield ranking that also includes running backs. But in their individual player rankings, they have Will Howard ranked 17th. So that's the ranking I'm going to use for Lindy's. Now, as we know, the Ohio State quarterback room includes, of course, Howard, who is a graduate transfer from Kansas State and the presumptive starter. Junior Devin Brown is in this group, sophomore Lincoln Kienholz, and then true freshman Julian Sayin from Alabama and true freshman Aaron Nolan. Now, I think this is one of the most interesting position groups on this roster, and not just because it's the most important position on the field. And how you view this room, I think, really depends on your perspective. If you're taking a long view of the Ohio State quarterback room, which has a pair of five-star prospects in Sayin and Nolan, then I think Athlon's ranking number 3 is about right. You know, if we're thinking about 2025 and beyond, I mean, without a doubt, Ohio State has one of the top 3 quarterback rooms in the country. You might even say they have the number 1 quarterback room in the country if we're thinking longer term. But if you're looking at this room in the here and now, and you're thinking about which of these players can realistically contribute this season, then I'm not going to quibble too much with where Lindy's and Phil Steele rank this room right now. Now, if Ohio State is going to outperform Lindy's and Phil Steele's rankings at this position, I think it really comes down to just one player, and that's Will Howard. Howard is far and away the most experienced and most productive quarterback of this group. He has over 1,800 career snaps, 778 career pass attempts, and he's accounted for 67 career touchdowns. After Howard, the most experienced player in this room is Devin Brown, who has a tiny fraction of Howard's experience, only 104 career snaps, 28 career pass attempts, and only 3 touchdowns for Brown. So look, I mean, Howard is the obvious choice here. Now, the big question about Howard for 2024 is, with the skilled talent around him in Columbus, can he play well enough to put himself into the discussion with the country's top quarterbacks for the first time in his career? I'm personally not going to rule that out right now. We saw Howard's ceiling in a really big moment last November at Texas. Now, he was magnificent in that game, 327 yards passing and 4 touchdowns. Kansas State had Texas, a playoff team, on the ropes in that game. They ended up losing by a field goal in overtime, but Howard was very impressive in that game. We glimpsed his ceiling, and he wasn't working with Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, and Trey Henderson that day, but he will be this season. So if I were a gambling man, and I'm not, but if I were, I think I'd wager that Will Howard will outperform Lindy's and Phil Steele's rankings for the quarterback room this year. I feel fairly confident in that. And who knows, he might even play well enough to put himself into the Heisman discussion. I think that's on the table too. Okay, let's have a look at the rankings for the Ohio State running back room according to Athlon, Lindy's, and Phil Steele. I'll spare you the suspense. All 3 publications have this room ranked number 1 in the country, and this should come as no surprise if you've been paying attention this offseason. Now, Lindy's, as I mentioned, did backfield rankings, which combines quarterbacks and running backs. They have Ohio State as the number 2 backfield in the country behind Georgia. That is, of course, largely on the strength of Quinshon Judkins and Trey Henderson. Now, in their individual player rankings, Lindy's has Judkins as the country's number 2 running back and Henderson at number 8. Ohio State is the only program that has 2 running backs in Lindy's top 10. So the way I'm interpreting that is Lindy's thinks Ohio State has the number 1 running back room in the country. Athlon and Phil Steele, of course, agree. So look, I mean, a room that already had a first-team All-Big Ten running back in Trey Henderson adds Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss. Judkins is a 2-time first-team All-SEC running back. Playing in college football's 2 preeminent leagues, these 2 backs, Judkins and Henderson, have combined for 5,470 yards rushing and 71 total touchdowns. I mean, that's absurd. And you combine that duo with a play caller in Chip Kelly, whose running games have been elite everywhere he's been, and the output from the Ohio State running game this season, I mean, it promises to be off the charts. I mean, probably not since Archie Griffin and Pete Johnson has there been a more devastating 1-2 punch in the Ohio State running game. So expectations are through the roof for the Ohio State running game this season. Now, if you want to nitpick, you could say that with Dallin Hayden transferring to Colorado, this room is a little short on veteran depth. But look, I mean, Ohio State has a very talented freshman in James Peoples in this room now. Peoples was the 126th overall prospect in the 2024 class, according to 24/7 Sports. And look, running back is a position where you can lean on a freshman if you need to. We've seen it before at Ohio State. Beanie Wells, J.K. Dobbins, Travion Henderson. I mean, Dobbins and Henderson started as freshmen. So I think if Ohio State has to turn to Peoples at some point this season, the feeling around Columbus is that he'll play well. I think most fans think that he'll play well, and there's good reason to expect that he will. Okay, let's have a look at where the Ohio State receivers landed in these 3 rankings. Lindy's has them number 1. Athlon's has the Ohio State receivers number 2. And Phil Steele ranks them number 3. Now, Athlon and Phil Steele have the Oregon receiver room number 1 in their rankings. Some very talented receivers in that room. The Ducks are going to be very, very good at that position this year. I don't really have a problem with that at this stage because the only proven commodity in this room for the Buckeyes right now is, of course, senior Emeka Egbuka. Now, Egbuka dealt with a high ankle sprain for much of last season and wasn't the impactful receiver that he was in 2022. But if he can stay healthy this season, Egbuka has a great shot at passing Michael Jenkins as the program's career leader in receiving yards. Egbuka only needs 1,041 yards this season to do that, which seems very achievable to me. But of course, the player everyone is talking about in this group is freshman phenom Jeremiah Smith, the number 1 overall player in the 2024 class, according to 24/7 Sports. Smith had a huge spring, and he's expected to start with Egbuka and Carnell Tate at receiver for the Buckeyes. Now, Carnell Tate himself was a 5-star prospect in the 2023 class. In limited action last season, Tate showed us flashes of the player that he can be with 264 yards receiving on 18 receptions and a touchdown. Egbuka, Smith, and Tate, look, these were all 5-star prospects. Egbuka and Smith were the number 1 receivers in the country in their respective classes. That trio is an utter embarrassment of riches, and I'm not even sure where you set the ceiling for that group. Now, there are 2 other players in this room that I'm very curious about. The first is Brandon Inniss, who was the number 35 overall player in the 2023 class. Inniss played sparingly last season as a freshman, only 32 snaps and 1 reception, but he made that 1 reception count. It was a 58-yard touchdown catch against Purdue. Now, the word around the Woody is that Inniss will be the next great slot receiver for the program. He was slowed by an injury in the spring. He did not play in the spring game, but the expectation is that Inniss is going to be ready by fall camp. Keep your eye on Brandon Inniss this season. I think he's going to have a substantial role for the Ohio State receivers. Now, the second player I'm really curious about is senior Jaden Ballard. Now, Ballard was a top 100 recruit out of Massillon, the number 55 overall prospect in the 2021 class. He has elite speed, similar to former Buckeye Devin Smith, who also comes from Massillon. Folks often compare Ballard and Smith because they both came from Massillon. They look like similar receivers. Now, to be fair to Ballard, he joined a receiver room as a freshman that already had Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. And his freshman classmates were Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka. So very, very difficult to stand out and make a name for yourself with that much talent around you. Only 191 career snaps and 9 career receptions for Ballard in his 3 seasons at Ohio State. He did not catch a pass last season. He was relegated to returning punts for most of 2023. He returned 9 punts for 49 yards last season. The Ohio State beat is saying the coaching staff has really been pushing Ballard to step up and to finally live up to his billing as a legitimate deep threat with that elite speed. I mean, even with Jeremiah Smith in the fold, you can never have too many receivers that can take the top off of a defense. So we'll see if Ballard can be a factor in that receiver room this season. I think they're going to need him at some point. Now, I did find it interesting that none of these publications did a unit ranking for tight ends, which I think is an interesting commentary on the state of that position in modern college football. And look, I don't know that there's a ton to talk about for Ohio State at tight end anyway, but I'll mention them here with the Ohio State receivers. The Buckeyes have 2 solid, serviceable tight ends, I think, in G. Scott Jr. and Will Kazmarek. I think those 2 players will get most of the snaps in 2024. Another player to watch is Jelani Thurman, the sophomore out of Georgia. He's another player that might contribute at that position this season. He is a mountain of a man. I think 6'6", well over 250 pounds, a very impressive-looking athlete, but still very young. Now, I don't think any of these players are the second coming of Brock Bowers, but I wouldn't consider them a weakness either. I think the Buckeyes are going to be fine at tight end. They'll be fine. Okay, let's have a look at where the Ohio State offensive line ranks according to Athlon, Lindy's, and Phil Steele. And this is where I was actually pleasantly surprised. Athlon ranks the Buckeye offensive line 10th nationally. Lindy's has them 6th, and Phil Steele has them 12th. Now, the offensive line is widely considered to be the weak link of the entire roster this season, and that's pretty well documented at this stage. I've said this before. I think Justin Fry has 4 starters that he can feel pretty good about. I mean, very good about. Josh Simmons at left tackle, Donovan Jackson at left guard, Seth McLaughlin, the Alabama transfer, at center, and Josh Fryer at right tackle. That's a veteran group of seniors who've played a lot of football in their careers. Now, a lot of the guys on the Ohio State beat shit on Jackson and Fryer last season, but the view of their performance outside of Columbus must have been pretty positive because both were voted first team all Big Ten by the media. And look, I think there's a quiet confidence around the Woody and Josh Simmons right now. Simmons steadily improved throughout 2023 and was actually playing pretty well by the end of the season. And then you have Seth McLaughlin. I mean, this is a 2-year starter at Alabama for Nick Saban, the greatest college football coach of all time. I think McLaughlin is going to be very good for this offensive line in 2024. So the only remaining question is at right guard, and that's really the only position on offense that's going to be up for grabs in fall camp. And I think there are 3 legitimate options on the roster right now who can fill that need and also provide much-needed depth for the offensive line as a whole. Those players are juniors Carson Hinsman and Tegra Shabola and sophomore Luke Montgomery. Now, Hinsman has a full season of starting experience under his belt. He played 758 snaps at center last season. Shabola was a top 50 recruit in the 2022 class. I mean, at 6'6", 327 pounds, now heading into his 3rd season with the program, we should expect Shabola to have a big role this season. And then there's Luke Montgomery, who was a fringe top 100 player in the 2023 class. He was rated 120 overall by 24/7 Sports. So there's no shortage of talent and ability in Montgomery either. I mean, looking at this group, maybe it's not Joe Moore award or bust, but I see a pretty high floor here. And look, I think there are a few improvements in some other areas that's going to help this group. First, Chip Kelly. Kelly is a master architect when it comes to designing a run game. I said it earlier, everywhere Kelly has been, his running games have been elite. UCLA led the Pac-12 in rushing offense under Kelly the last 2 seasons. And all 4 of Kelly's teams at Oregon led the Pac-12 in rushing. And I think what he's going to do is get Ohio State out of the predictable tendencies that made it very easy or easier for defenses to defend the Ohio State rushing game the last few seasons. I think Kelly is going to make life easier for the Ohio State offensive line in 2024 in that regard. I also think having a more mobile quarterback in Will Howard, who has better pocket presence than Kyle McCord and is better at evading pressure, is going to help the confidence of the Ohio State offensive line this season. So I think there's good reason to expect a huge jump in the play of the Ohio State offensive line in 2024. And I think they've got a good chance to outperform some of these preseason rankings. Okay, let's have a look at where Athlon, Lindy's, and Phil Steele rank Ohio State position groups on defense. And let's start with the defensive line. All three publications have the Buckeye defensive line ranked as the number one unit in the country. That's probably no surprise to most fans, and we are all very familiar with this group. Defensive ends JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, defensive tackles Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton. That group will be as good as any starters in the country. Now, Tuimoloau, Sawyer, and Williams almost never left the field last year. They all played well over 600 snaps in 2023. I mean, that's entirely too many snaps. There is no reason to run that group into the ground in 2024 because there's depth here now. You've got Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry at defensive end who are ready for much bigger roles in 2024. They are two very good defensive ends that could start at 100 other programs. You also have Mitchell Melton, who appears to be ready for a larger role, and he should be able to help them off the edge this season as well. Melton is he's more of a candidate for the jack position, but I think he can probably play some defensive end as well. I was also very impressed from what I saw from freshman Edric Houston in the spring game. He's another player that should be able to help the Ohio State defensive line this season. Finally, you also have Hero Canoe and Jason Moore, who are two players I think that Larry Johnson can get quality snaps from on the interior. You know, they should be able to spell Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton at key moments during the season. So this is a very talented, very deep defensive line for Ohio State this year. Now, my challenge to this unit in 2024 is to make a lot more plays behind the line of scrimmage. Start getting home, right? I mean, not counting 2020, which was shortened by COVID, last season's sack total of 28 was the lowest output by a Buckeye defense since 2016. And the 72 tackles for loss last year was the lowest total since 2012. I mean, there's just entirely too much talent and depth to be making such little impact behind the line of scrimmage. Just for reference, the 2014 defense had 45 sacks and 110 tackles for loss. And the 2002 team had 40 sacks and 100 tackles for loss. Guess what those two defenses did? Yep, they won a national championship. So that's the bar that I'm setting for this defensive line for Ohio State, right? We need to see a sack total in the 40s and a tackles for loss total over 100. And the defensive line will be a big part of those statistics, obviously. Okay, let's have a look at where Athlon, Lindy's, and Phil Steele rank the Ohio State secondary. All three have that unit number one in their rankings. So we're talking about the number one defensive line in the country, according to these three publications, and now the number one secondary. We know who these players are. Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, Jordan Hancock. That trio of cornerbacks are as good as any in the country. Lathan Ransom also returns for this unit. The Ohio State pass defense was number one a year ago, and now joining those four players is star safety Caleb Downs, the Alabama transfer, and number one rated player in the transfer portal this offseason. This unit projects, in my opinion, as the best Ohio State secondary since 1998. Now, that unit featured Antoine Winfield, Ahmed Plummer, Damon Moore, and Gary Berry. Winfield and Plummer were first-round draft picks. Damon Moore had a very successful NFL career. Can't remember what happened to Gary Berry, but I believe he played in the NFL as well. I think the 2024 unit is going to be better than that unit, though. And I think it also is going to have more depth than the 1998 squad. There are two reserves here I want to flag who I think are about as talented as the starters. And that's cornerbacks Jermaine Matthews and Calvin Simpson-Hunt. We actually saw a fair amount of Matthews last season. He had a pick six against Western Kentucky. He started in place of an injured Denzel Burke against Penn State and Rutgers and played very well. And Simpson Hunt was a top 100 player out of Texas in the 2023 class. Now, he only played 23 snaps last season, but by all accounts, he had a great spring. He's ready for a bigger role in 2024. I think Tim Walton could play either one of these two kids in place of Burke or Igbinosun, and the defense wouldn't miss a beat. So this is a very talented, very deep secondary that might be, we'll have to see him do it first, might be the best secondary we've ever seen at Ohio State. Now, my challenge to this group and to the defense as a whole, but I think it's going to be largely the responsibility of this group, is to create more turnovers in 2024. Only 7 interceptions for the Ohio State defense last season. That is the lowest output by an Ohio State defense since 2005. And the Buckeye defense only had 11 total takeaways in 2023. Now, I scoured the records to try to find an Ohio State defense that produced fewer than 11 turnovers. I went as far back as 1970, and I could not find a Buckeye defense that recorded fewer than 11 takeaways. I mean, that's insane. I mean, if I didn't know any better, I would have thought the Ohio State defense actually made a conscious effort to avoid forcing turnovers last year because there's just so much talent on that defense. They were so good in virtually every other area. But to only produce 11 total takeaways just made me think that they just weren't even trying to create them. Look, you've got Caleb Downs patrolling the back end of that defense. You've got absurd talent up front, and in the secondary you have depth. You should be creating a hell of a lot more turnovers than 11 this season. And so that's my big challenge for this unit. Okay, finally, let's have a look at where the Ohio State linebackers landed in these rankings. The linebackers are kind of a forgotten group in this defense, and maybe it's because Jim Knowles only plays 2 linebackers in this scheme. But this is not a position group a lot of people seem to be talking about right now. Now, Athlon has the Buckeye linebackers ranked 7th. Phil Steele has them 12th. Now, Lindy's only ranked the country's top 10 units, and the Buckeyes did not make this list for Lindy's. I think the linebackers might turn out to be the most underrated and perhaps the most underappreciated unit on this team. Now, Athlon's ranking seems to be accounting for the upside of Sonny Styles, who has moved over from safety, and C.J. Hicks. Now, Styles and Hicks are former 5-star prospects. Cody Simon, we think, has locked down one of the 2 starting spots. Simon is the ultimate kind of do-your-job guy. He's assignment sound. I think he's going to make a very solid Mike linebacker for this team this year. Now, Hicks and Styles are going to be battling for the starting will, which is the only position on the defensive side of the ball that I think is up for grabs. Hicks seemed to have the upper hand in that battle coming out of the spring, but I think the loser is still likely to have a very big role at linebacker for this defense. Now, the emergence of Hicks and the addition of Styles to the linebacker room, I think, make this a very interesting position group. I think Hicks and Styles bring more athleticism and playmaking to the position than what Ohio State had the last 2 seasons with, Tommy Eichenberg and Steel Chambers. And I would personally love to see a package that has Hicks and Styles on the field together. Another player I'm very intrigued by, and maybe his opportunities probably won't come until 2025, is Gabe Powers. I thought Powers looked really, really good in the spring game. Look, I think the linebacker group could surprise a lot of people in 2024. And I think it has the potential to be one of the best rooms in the country by the end of the season. This is going to be a very interesting position group to watch in 2024. Okay, that was a mouthful. But to summarize, according to the 3 most respected college football preview magazines, Ohio State enters the 2024 season with the best running back room, the best offensive line, and the best secondary in the country. They have a top 3 receiver room, and they're very solid with a lot of upside everywhere else. Okay, that's going to do it for me. Look for another pod from Paige, Chad, and myself in the coming weeks. We're going to drill down on the 5 games that are going to define Ohio State's 2024 regular season schedule in that pod. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and visit our website at southstandsosu.com.